The Nagasaki bomb was followed by a stark warning from U.S. Secretary of State James Burns.
There is still time, but little time, for the Japanese to save themselves from the destruction which threatens them.
The intention was clear. The atom bomb would be used again and again until Japan gave in. That same day, Japan's position became even more precarious. Early in the morning of August the 9th, 1.5 million Soviet troops stormed into Manchuria and northern China. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was not only after territory, he wanted a say in any final peace settlement in the Far East. There were still over 1 million Japanese troops in the area, but the Red Army blitzkrieg was unstoppable. The Japanese position in the war had become untenable. That evening, Emperor Hirohito met with his 6 top military and political leaders. The war cabinet was divided. 3, led by the Prime Minister, Baron Kantaro Suzuki, argued for peace. The other 3 wanted to continue fighting. It was deadlock. Then the Japanese Prime Minister broke with all precedent and asked the Emperor for his opinion. Emperor Hirohito voted for peace, on condition that his position as head of state was maintained. The next morning, on July the 10th, the proposal was sent to the U.S. Secretary of State James Burns. Burns rejected it. Only unconditional surrender would do. As the Japanese war cabinet argued amongst itself, Soviet troops continued to tear into Mongolia. At the same time, American fighters now roamed freely over Japan, shooting up military targets and transport links at will. Massive air raids continued to devastate Japan. Then, on August the 14th, the Truman administration sent word that the Emperor's position would be safeguarded, provided he agreed to accept the orders of the Supreme Commander of Allied forces. Hirohito used his huge prestige to instruct the war cabinet to endure the unendurable and accept the terms. That day in Washington, President Truman announced that Japan had surrendered unconditionally.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
Cheering, singing crowds erupted onto the streets of every American city. In Britain, it was midnight when the new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, broadcast the news.
Japan has today surrendered. The last of our enemies is laid low. Peace has once again come to the world. Let us thank God for this great deliverance and his mercies. Long live the King.
Within minutes, crowds appeared on the streets of London. Many gathered outside Buckingham Palace. A giant street party lasted well into the following day. The next morning, August the 15th, an astounded Japanese people listened to the voice of their God Emperor for the very first time. He told them that Japan's position had become impossible, and the country was obliged to surrender. All military forces must lay down their arms. Such was the Emperor's prestige that almost every unit obeyed. But in Manchuria, despite the Japanese ceasefire, the Soviet forces fought on. For the first time, large numbers of Japanese troops now surrendered. Nevertheless, the Soviets, determined to seize as much territory as possible, continued to advance. Stalin wouldn't stop the fighting for another week. By then, the whole of Manchuria, half of Korea, and part of northern China were under his control. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines and on many of the Pacific islands bypassed by the Americans, it took weeks for news of the surrender to reach isolated Japanese garrisons. Some Japanese soldiers would remain hidden in the jungle for more than 30 years. Finally, on August the 28th, 2 weeks after the surrender, the first US troops arrived in Japan. A huge US fleet gathered in Tokyo Bay, sailing past the shattered hulks of the once proud Japanese Navy that they had so comprehensively defeated. Several days later, on September the 2nd, 1945, a Japanese delegation came aboard the USS battleship Missouri. On its quarterdeck, the new Japanese Foreign Minister, Mamoru Shigemitsu, signed the document of unconditional surrender. It was countersigned by US General Douglas MacArthur, the man who would effectively run Japan for the next 6 years.
As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it my firm purpose, in the tradition of the countries I represent, to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance.
Then a force of more than 2,000 Allied aircraft roared overhead. It was a fitting tribute to the overwhelming power which had finally brought Germany and Japan to utter defeat. World War II was at an end. Japan's ruthless desire to wage war had been crushed by a weapon of awesome destructive power. Now, in the East as in the West, the world would be divided and shared along new lines. New allegiances would be formed, and new enemies would vie for global influence under the spectre of nuclear war. A new era in world history had begun.